In the quiet suburban town of Willow Creek, where white picket fences lined the streets and neighbors greeted one another with friendly waves, Officer Jonathan John Miller was a name that evoked mixed reactions. To some, he was the epitome of discipline, a former soldier turned cop who believed in the sanctity of rules and order. To others, especially those who felt the sting of his stern demeanor, he was a man who saw the world in black and white, with no room for the shades of gray that made up real life. The story that unfolded one sweltering summer afternoon would shake the very foundations of John's belief system, challenging not only his view of the world, but also his understanding of himself. It would start with an innocent mistake, a moment of misjudgment, but what followed would ripple through the lives of everyone involved, igniting a chain of events that exposed hidden truths, shattered assumptions, and ultimately brought a community to its knees before lifting it back up. This is not just a story of redemption. It's a story of second chances, of the courage it takes to confront one's own flaws, and the healing power of forgiveness. But before all that, it began with a strict enforcer, a small-town cop, whose conviction would be tested in ways he never imagined. Willow Creek basked in the late afternoon sun, its tranquil streets bathed in a golden glow. Officer John Miller drove his patrol car at a steady pace, his sharp eyes scanning the tidy rows of houses and manicured lawns. The rhythmic hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio were his only companions on what seemed to be another uneventful day. John was a man of habit. Every morning, he polished his badge until it gleamed like a silver promise. Discipline defined him, honed by years of military service that had shaped his approach to life and law enforcement. To John, the badge symbolized not just authority, but a responsibility to uphold order in an unpredictable world. As his patrol car rounded the corner onto Elm Street, John's gaze fell on a group of teenagers loitering near a gas station. Instinctively, he slowed down. He recognized some of the faces, a mix of locals and others he didn't know. His hand hovered near the radio as he observed them. Their laughter sounded innocent enough, but John's experience told him that where there was smoke, there was often fire. He stepped out of the car, adjusting his belt and squaring his shoulders. "All right, break it up," he barked, his voice firm. The teens exchanged wary glances, their amusement evaporating as they shuffled away. John watched them until they disappeared from view, satisfaction flickering in his chest. Order restored. Continuing his patrol, John reflected briefly on the military drills that had instilled his sense of duty. Growing up in a small town much like Willow Creek, he had seen what chaos could do to a community when rules were ignored. His father, a factory worker, had once told him, "The world's got enough people breaking rules. Be the guy who keeps things in line." John had taken that advice to heart, sometimes to a fault. A crackling voice came over the radio, but it was background noise to John's thoughts as he turned onto Main Street, where the small-town charm of Willow Creek was on full display. The corner cafe buzzed with patrons, and the grocery store bustled with customers weaving through aisles stacked with fresh produce. It was here, outside the grocery store, that John spotted her. A young girl, no more than 9, sat on a bench near the entrance. She had dark curls tied back, with a bright yellow ribbon, and clutched a small pack of crackers. Her eyes scanned the crowd curiously, and her feet swung gently off the edge of the bench. John frowned. Something about her seemed out of place, not just her solitary presence, but the uneasy way she looked around. John's training kicked in. He parked his car across the street and watched her for a moment. The grocery store was a hot spot for petty theft, and the girl's lone figure raised questions in his mind. Where were her parents? Why was she eating outside instead of inside? John stepped out of the car, the pavement hot under his boots as he crossed the street. "Excuse me, young lady," he said, his voice sharp but not unkind. The girl looked up, her brown eyes wide with surprise. "Yes, sir," she said softly, her fingers tightening around the crackers. John crouched slightly to meet her eye level, though his imposing frame still loomed over her. "What are you doing here all by yourself?" "I'm waiting for my mom," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's inside shopping." John's gaze flicked to the crackers. "And those? Did you pay for them?" The girl's lip trembled. "My mommy gave them to me," she said, holding up the package as if to prove her innocence. But John's mind was already racing, fueled by years of seeing the worst in people. He straightened, his expression hardening. "Stay right here," he said, stepping into the store. The cashier, a teenager with earbuds dangling from his ears, shrugged when John asked about the girl. "Didn't see her take anything," the cashier said. But John wasn't convinced. Returning to the bench, John's tone grew sterner. "Are you sure about that, young lady? Taking things without paying is a serious offense." Tears welled up in the girl's eyes as she shook her head fervently. "I didn't steal. I promise." The sound of her sobs drew the attention of passers-by. A small crowd began to gather, murmurs of confusion and concern rippling through the onlookers. Someone held up a phone, its camera capturing the unfolding scene. "I'm taking you in," John declared, grabbing her by the arm. Her cries grew louder, and the crowd erupted into protests. "Officer, she's just a kid," someone shouted. "Where's her mom?" another demanded. As John placed the girl in the back of his patrol car, he felt a pang of doubt. But the rules were the rules, and he had sworn to enforce them. What he didn't realize was that this small decision, made in the heat of suspicion, would be the spark that ignited a firestorm. The girl's tear-streaked face stared at him through the rearview mirror as he drove away, her cries echoing in his ears. Outside, the murmuring crowd began. The police station buzzed with its usual monotony. Officers shuffled papers, radios crackled sporadically, and the faint hum of the air conditioner provided a dull background to the murmur of voices. Officer Jonathan "John" Miller sat at his desk, his back rigid, his face an unreadable mask. Outside, the late afternoon sun poured through the blinds, streaking his workspace with golden lines. John wasn't one to linger in doubt, but today was different. The incident with the young girl, Olivia Carter, as her tearful mother had later screamed at him, gnawed at the edges of his conscience. The echoes of the crowd's disapproval and the girl's tearful protests replayed in his mind, louder than he cared to admit. The front doors of the station swung open with a force that silenced the room. In stormed Grace Carter, her strides purposeful, her voice already cutting through the air like a blade. "Where is he?" she demanded, her sharp gaze scanning the room. Grace was a striking woman, with fierce determination etched into every line of her face. Her curly hair framed her face like a lion's mane, and her hands clenched the strap of her purse as though it were the only thing holding her fury at bay. John looked up from his desk, his eyes meeting Grace's for a fleeting moment before he stood and adjusted his belt. "Ma'am," he began, his tone carefully measured. "I understand you're upset." "Upset?" Grace's voice rose, quivering with emotion. "You handcuffed my 9-year-old daughter, accused her of theft, and dragged her off like a criminal in front of a crowd. You're lucky I'm not more than upset." The room grew still as Grace's words echoed. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene or stay seated. John felt the weight of their eyes on him, and for the first time his usual confidence faltered. She had no business being out there alone, ma'am, John said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. I acted based on the situation as I saw it. Grace stepped closer, her voice low but no less fierce. The situation you saw. You didn't see her. You saw her skin color, didn't you? You saw trouble where there was none. John flinched as though struck, but he quickly straightened his shoulders. That's not fair, he countered. But even as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow. The murmurs in the station grew louder, officers whispering among themselves, their glances darting between John and Grace. Fair? Grace's voice cracked with incredulity. You want to talk about fairness when my daughter is at home, crying, because she doesn't understand why someone who's supposed to protect her treated her like a criminal? John opened his mouth to respond, but Grace wasn't done. I'm filing a complaint against you, she said, her tone final. Not just for my daughter, but for every family that's been on the receiving end of your so-called protocol. She turned on her heel and stormed out, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. By the time the formal complaint reached Chief Anderson's desk, the incident had already begun to spread. Videos of John's confrontation with Olivia outside the grocery store were circulating on social media, accompanied by hashtags like #JusticeForOlivia and #AccountabilityNow. The footage showed a scared little girl being led away in handcuffs, her cries cutting through the chatter of the growing crowd. John sat in the chief's office, his stomach churning, as he faced his superior. Chief Anderson was a seasoned officer, his graying hair and weary eyes, testament to years of balancing the thin line between enforcing the law and maintaining community trust. John, the chief began, folding his hands on the desk. We have a problem. A big one. Sir, I was just doing my job, John said, his voice steady, though his palms were clammy. The girl was acting suspiciously. The chief held up a hand, silencing him. And because of that, you didn't stop to think. You didn't ask questions, John. You just assumed. Now we've got a community in an uproar and a formal complaint against you for racial profiling. John's face reddened. With all due respect, sir, I don't see how this is racial profiling. I followed protocol. Did you? The chief's tone was sharper now. Or did you let your biases dictate your actions? John's breath caught. Biases? He wanted to argue, but something about the chief's piercing gaze made the words die in his throat. You're suspended, the chief said, his voice firm but not unkind. Pending an investigation. Turn in your badge and gun. That night, John sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the weight of his badge now gone from his chest, but heavy on his mind. The sound of the clock ticking filled the silence as he nursed a glass of whiskey, his thoughts spiraling. I was just doing my job, he muttered to the empty room. But the words rang hollow, bouncing off the walls with a mocking echo. John leaned back on the worn couch, staring at the ceiling. Memories of his military days. John leaned back, on the worn couch, staring at the ceiling. Memories of his military days surfaced, moments when he had to make quick decisions under pressure. Back then, his instincts had been sharp, reliable. But now those instincts felt flawed, clouded by something he couldn't quite name. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, dragging him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Incoming call. Mom. He let it ring out, unable to face the inevitable questions. What would he say? That he'd been suspended? That the town he'd sworn to protect was now turning against him? As the night deepened, John turned on the news. The footage of him handcuffing Olivia played on the screen, accompanied by a panel of commentators discussing police accountability. One phrase stood out, sinking into John like a knife. Systemic bias in policing. Was that what this was? John shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought, but it clung to him like a shadow. He had always prided himself on being fair, on upholding the law without prejudice. Yet Olivia's tearful face haunted him, and Grace's words echoed in his mind. You didn't see her. You saw her skin color. The following day, John was summoned back to the station, not as an officer, but as a subject of investigation. He kept his head low as he walked through the halls, the eyes of his colleagues following him. Once, those eyes had been filled with respect. Now they held something else, doubt, even judgment. The chief's voice was somber as he delivered the news. The investigation will be thorough, John. And given the footage, the department is under intense scrutiny. John nodded, the reality settling like a stone in his gut. He left the office and walked back through the station, passing his fellow officers. Some averted their gaze, while others offered stiff nods. The camaraderie he'd once relied on now felt distant. That evening, as John sat in his car outside the station, he overheard a conversation between two officers. You hear about the Carter's charity? The Helping Hands Project? One said. John frowned, his ears perking up. Yeah, the other replied. They're the ones feeding all those struggling families in the community. It's run by that lady Grace and her daughter. John's heart sank. Grace Carter, Olivia Carter, the very people he had wronged. As the voices faded, John sat frozen, his mind racing. He had seen the Carters as adversaries, but now a new image began to form, one that challenged everything he thought he knew. Could he face them again? Did he even have the right to try? John started the car, the engine roaring to life. But for the first time, he hesitated before driving off. Something deep within him whispered that his journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next morning was unusually quiet. For Officer John Miller, the usual hustle and bustle of the Willow Creek Police Department felt distant as he sat at home, staring blankly at his kitchen table. His badge and gun, now turned in, left a void on the counter where they once resided. The sharp clink of his coffee mug against the wood snapped him out of his daze. Suspended. The word echoed in his mind, a dull ache gnawing at his pride. John had always believed himself to be an officer who upheld the law without bias, one who prioritized rules over emotion. Yet here he was, stripped of authority and accused of the very thing he had prided himself on avoiding: prejudice. When John walked into the station later that day to clean out his locker, the atmosphere was stifling. Conversations halted as he passed, and his fellow officers avoided eye contact. Once the department's rising star, John now felt like an unwelcome intruder in his own precinct. Officer Megan Daniels, one of the more compassionate voices on the force, approached him hesitantly. John, she started softly. How are you holding up? I'm fine, John replied curtly, his eyes fixed on his locker. Megan sighed. Look, I know things are messy right now, but maybe this is an opportunity to reflect, you know. Reflect on what, Megan? John snapped, turning to face her. On doing my job, on following protocol. Her lips thinned, and she stepped back. Sometimes it's not just about the rules, John. It's about how you apply them. With that, she walked away, leaving John stewing in frustration. John's focus shifted to the sound of quiet murmurs a few lockers away. Two officers, Martinez and Rogers, were deep in conversation, their voices low but audible. That charity Grace Carter runs, Helping Hands. Did you know they've been around for years? Martinez said. Yeah, Rogers replied. It's funny. I think they even helped my cousin's family once when he lost his job. Caroline Carter's a saint, from what I hear. John's ears perked up at the mention of the charity, and an uncomfortable memory surfaced. A time when his own family had received unexpected help during a rough patch. But he pushed it aside, locking his jaw as he finished packing his belongings. Whatever their charity was, it didn't change the facts, or so he told himself. That evening, John's apartment felt suffocating. The walls seemed closer, the air thicker, as he sat on the couch, the television flickering with images of news reports dissecting his actions. The words racial profiling appeared in bold letters, scrolling across the screen. "This isn't me," John muttered, his fists clenching. "They don't know what it's like out there. Suspicion is part of the job." But as the hours dragged on, his mind kept circling back to Olivia's face. Her wide, tear-filled eyes, her trembling voice as she pleaded with him. He tried to shake the image, but it clung to him like a shadow. Unable to bear the silence, John reached for his phone. He scrolled aimlessly through his contacts, hesitating when he landed on his mother's name. For years, she had been his moral compass, always encouraging him to see beyond the surface. But tonight, he couldn't face her disappointment. Instead, he opened a search engine and typed, "Helping Hands Project, Willow Creek." The first result was a simple website with a banner that read, "Helping Hands, Feeding Hope, one meal at a time." Below it, smiling faces filled the screen, families holding boxes of food, children clutching backpacks, and a familiar woman standing at the forefront. Grace Carter. John's stomach churned as he scrolled further. Testimonials filled the page, detailing how the charity had helped countless families in need. Then, a specific story caught his eye. A man recounting how the Carters' charity had delivered food to his home during a holiday season when his father had been laid off. The memory struck John like a lightning bolt. He had been that boy once, grateful for the kindness of strangers. John sat back, rubbing his temples. How had he not connected the dots sooner? The Carters weren't just another family in Willow Creek. They were pillars of the community, doing what he once swore to do: protect and serve, albeit in a different way. That night, John dreamt of his father, a proud man who had struggled silently to provide for his family during hard times. In the dream, his father's voice was clear and firm. "Never forget where you come from, John, and never think you're better than the people you serve." He woke up in a cold sweat, the words echoing in his mind. The following morning, John found himself outside the Helping Hands Charity Center. The modest brick building was surrounded by volunteers unloading trucks of supplies, their chatter lively and warm. John hesitated, his hand resting on the car door. What was he even doing here? Seeking redemption? Offering an apology? He wasn't sure, but he couldn't ignore the pull. As he stepped out, a young woman approached him, her clipboard in hand. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but wary. John paused, clearing his throat. "I'm John Miller. I'd like to volunteer." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. "The same John Miller from the grocery store incident?" John nodded, the weight of her scrutiny making him feel smaller. "Yes, and I want to help. I need to." She didn't respond immediately, but after a moment, she gestured toward a stack of boxes. "Start over there. We'll see how it goes." John spent the day unloading supplies, his uniform replaced by a simple t-shirt and jeans. But no matter how hard he worked, he could feel the cold stares of the volunteers around him. Whispers followed him as he moved through the center, their words sharp and cutting. "That's the cop who arrested that little girl," one man muttered. "What's he doing here?" another asked. Grace Carter eventually appeared, her presence commanding as she walked into the room. She froze when her eyes landed on John, her expression a mix of shock and anger. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice low but firm. John straightened, meeting her gaze. "I want to help." Grace crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "Help? Is that what you call this? Do you think showing up here erases what you did to my daughter?" "No," John admitted, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "But I have to start somewhere." The room fell silent, all eyes on Grace as she stared at him. After what felt like an eternity, she gave a curt nod. "Fine. But don't think for a second this means you're forgiven." As John packed up for the day, he noticed Olivia standing in the doorway, her small frame illuminated by the afternoon sun. She looked at him briefly, her gaze filled with a mixture of curiosity and caution, before darting away. John exhaled deeply, realizing how far he still had to go. But for the first time since the incident, he felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile yet undeniable chance to make things right. The sky was painted a pale gray as John parked his car outside the Helping Hands Project building for the second time. The modest brick building looked no different than it had a few days prior. But something inside him had shifted. The seed of doubt that had been planted during his suspension was now sprouting roots. The whispers of his colleagues about the Carter's charity had stayed with him, prodding his curiosity and guilt alike. He stepped out of his car, adjusting his jacket against the crisp autumn air, and made his way toward the entrance. Volunteers bustled about, their voices carrying an air of determination and purpose. John hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, bracing himself for the cold reception he was sure to receive. The inside of the building was a hive of activity. Tables were stacked with donations, clothing, non-perishable foods, and toys. A group of children sat in one corner, coloring while their parents sorted through donated items. The atmosphere was warm despite the chill outside, a stark contrast to John's inner turmoil. A voice broke through the din. "You're back." John turned to see the same young woman from his first visit, standing with her arms crossed, her clipboard tucked under one arm. Her name tag read Emma. "I am," John replied, offering a tentative smile. "I wanted to learn more about the work you do here." Emma's expression softened slightly, but her tone remained cautious. "We're busy, Officer Miller. If you're here to help, there's plenty to do." John nodded, grateful for the chance. "I'll get to work." As John sorted through boxes of canned goods, he overheard snippets of conversations around him. Volunteers spoke of families who had come through their doors, their stories ranging from heartbreaking to hopeful. He listened quietly, his hands moving mechanically as he absorbed the weight of their words. During a break, Emma approached him with a flyer. "If you want to know what we're about, read this," she said, handing it over. The flyer detailed the charity's mission: to provide dignity and support to families in need, fostering a community of care and compassion. Below the mission statement were statistics about food insecurity in the area and testimonials from families who had been helped by Helping Hands. One testimonial stood out. "When my dad lost his job, we didn't know how we'd make it through the holidays. Helping Hands gave us food, clothes, and hope. I'll never forget their kindness." John's throat tightened as he read the words. He could have written that testimonial himself. A flood of memories came rushing back. His father's quiet despair during a tough Christmas, his mother's tearful gratitude as they unpacked a box of donated goods, and the warm meal they shared that night. Helping Hands had been there for his family, though he had never known their name until now. That evening, John sat in his dimly lit apartment, the flyers spread out on the table before him. He stared at the Helping Hands logo, a pair of hands cradling a heart, and felt a pang of shame. The very people he had wronged had once been his family's lifeline. His thoughts drifted to his late father, a proud man who had struggled to keep their family afloat during hard times. John could almost hear his voice. Never look down on someone who's struggling, son. You don't know their story. John clenched his fists, the weight of his past decisions pressing down on him. He had forgotten those lessons, blinded by a rigid belief in rules and protocols. And now, he had to face the consequences of that blindness. The next day, John returned to Helping Hands, determined to contribute meaningfully. This time, he was tasked with distributing food to families who came to the center. As he handed over bags filled with groceries, he saw the gratitude in their eyes, gratitude he had once felt as a child. Near the end of his shift, Grace Carter entered the room. She moved with purpose, her presence commanding yet approachable. When her eyes landed on John, she froze, her expression a mixture of surprise and guardedness. "Officer Miller," she said. Her tone clipped. "What are you doing here?" John straightened, meeting her gaze. "I'm here to help." Grace crossed her arms. "Help? Or assuage your guilt?" John's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Both," he admitted. "I know I have a lot to make up for. I just want to do what I can." Her eyes narrowed, studying him intently. After a long pause, she nodded. "Fine. But understand this. You're on thin ice." As the weeks passed, John immersed himself in the work at Helping Hands. He sorted donations, packed boxes, and even helped repair a leaky faucet in the kitchen. Slowly, he began to earn the respect of the volunteers, though skepticism lingered in their glances. One afternoon, John found himself working alongside Grace. The two worked in silence, the tension between them palpable. Finally, John broke the silence. "I read about what you do here," he said, his voice hesitant. "It's incredible." Grace glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "It's necessary. People need support, especially when the system fails them." John nodded. "I know. My family. We were one of those people once. Your charity helped us when I was a kid." Grace's hands stilled. She looked at him, surprise flickering across her face. "I didn't know that." John swallowed hard. "I didn't either, until recently. It's part of why I'm here. To give back." For a moment, Grace's expression softened, but she quickly composed herself. "Words are easy, Officer Miller. Actions are what matter." That evening, as John walked to his car, he saw Olivia sitting on the steps outside the building. She was sketching in a small notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she noticed him, her body tensed, and she quickly closed the notebook. "Hi, Olivia," John said gently, stopping a few feet away. She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the ground. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," John continued. "For everything?" Olivia looked up, her eyes wary. "Why did you think I was bad?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hit John like a punch to the gut. He struggled for an answer, but the truth felt inadequate. "I made a mistake," he admitted, "and I'm trying to make it right." Olivia studied him for a long moment before standing and walking back inside without another word. John watched her go, his heart heavy but resolute. He knew trust wouldn't come easily, but he was willing to earn it. Later that night, John received a call from Emma. "We're hosting a community dinner next week," she said. "Grace wants you to help organize it." John felt a flicker of hope. "I'll be there," he promised. As he hung up, he realized this was more than just an opportunity to give back. It was a chance to rebuild the bridges he had burned. But would the community be willing to meet him halfway? Only time would tell. The air was brisk as John arrived at the Helping Hands project early on a Saturday morning. His breath formed small clouds as he exhaled, each puff a reminder of the growing tension in his chest. Today was the first day he would actively engage in organizing an event with Grace Carter and the volunteers. Despite his resolve to make amends, he knew earning their trust would be no easy feat. The community dinner was just a few days away, and the charity center was abuzz with activity. Volunteers scurried between tables stacked with supplies, preparing decorations, and sorting donated food. John stood at the entrance for a moment, absorbing the scene. This wasn't just about feeding people, it was about creating a space where everyone felt valued. As John stepped inside, the room seemed to quiet briefly. Volunteers exchanged uneasy glances, their whispers barely audible, but unmistakable. "That's him," one murmured. "I can't believe Grace agreed to let him help," another added. John felt the weight of their judgment, but kept his head high. He approached the main table where Grace was reviewing a checklist. She didn't look up as he approached. "Morning," John said, trying to keep his tone neutral. Grace finally glanced up, her expression cool. "You're late." John checked his watch. He wasn't, but he didn't argue. "What can I do to help?" Grace handed him a clipboard. "We need someone to sort through the donated produce. Anything spoiled goes in the compost bin. Think you can handle that?" John nodded. "I'll get started." The task seemed straightforward enough, but as John worked, he quickly realized how meticulous the process was. Each piece of fruit or vegetable had to be inspected carefully. A volunteer named Rosa, an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, joined him. "You don't have to impress anyone here," Rosa said, without looking up. "Just do your job." John glanced at her, unsure how to respond. "I'm not trying to impress anyone," he replied. "I just want to help." Rosa's silence was telling, but she didn't press further. They worked in near silence for the next hour, the only sounds being the rustle of produce and the occasional thud of spoiled items hitting the compost bin. By mid-morning, John had finished sorting the produce and moved on to setting up tables for the dinner. He noticed a group of volunteers struggling to carry a large folding table and rushed over to help. "Let me take that," he offered, grabbing one end. The volunteer on the other side, a younger man named Eric, hesitated before nodding. "Sure." As they carried the table across the room, John tried to strike up a conversation. "How long have you been volunteering here?" "Couple of years," Eric replied curtly. "My family's been coming here since I was a kid." John nodded, unsure how to bridge the gap. "It's a great thing Grace has built here." Eric stopped suddenly, setting the table down with a thud. "Yeah, it is, which is why it's hard to see someone like you here." John froze, the words hitting him like a slap. "Someone like me?" Eric crossed his arms. "You don't get it, do you? You put Olivia in handcuffs. A kid. You think showing up here and moving tables makes up for that?" "I know it doesn't," John said quietly. "But I'm trying to change. I'm trying to do better." Eric shook his head. "Good luck with that." He walked away, leaving John standing there, the weight of his mistakes heavier than ever. Despite the hostility, John continued to push through the day, focusing on his tasks and keeping his interactions polite but professional. By lunchtime, he had earned a few nods of acknowledgement from the volunteers, though most still kept their distance. As he was sweeping the floor near the entrance, he heard a soft voice behind him. "You missed a spot." John turned to see Olivia standing there, her arms crossed and her expression guarded. "Did I?" he asked, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Olivia pointed to a corner where a few crumbs had escaped the broom's reach. John walked over and swept them up, then looked back at her. "Better?" Olivia shrugged, but didn't walk away. "Why are you here?" she asked, after a long pause. John set the broom aside and crouched down to her level. "Because I made a mistake, a big one, and I want to make things right." Olivia studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Mom says actions speak louder than words." "She's right," John said. "That's why I'm here." Olivia didn't reply, but she didn't leave either. Instead, she sat down on a nearby bench and pulled out a small sketch pad. Flipping it open to a half-finished drawing, John recognized it immediately. The Helping Hands logo. "That's really good," he said. Olivia glanced up, her expression softening slightly. "Thanks." Later that afternoon, Grace called John into her office. The room was small but tidy, with walls lined with photos of past charity events. Grace sat behind her desk, her fingers steepled, as she regarded John with a critical eye. "You've been working hard," she said. "But hard work, doesn't erase what you did." "I know," John said, his voice steady. "I'm not here to erase anything. I'm here to take responsibility." Grace leaned forward. "Then let me make this clear. This dinner isn't just about feeding people. It's about building trust. That's something you can't fix with a broom and a smile." "What can I do?" John asked. Grace's gaze softened slightly, though her tone remained firm. "Show people who you are. Not the badge, not the uniform. Just you. Let them see that you're more than the mistakes you've made." John nodded. "I will." The day of the community dinner arrived, and the Helping Hands project was bustling with activity. John stood in the kitchen, helping Rosa plate meals as volunteers filed in and out. The dining area was filling quickly, families and individuals chatting and laughing as they found their seats. Grace approached John, handing him a tray of food. "It's time," she said. "Go out there and serve." John hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. He knew this was more than just a task. It was a test. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out into the dining area, his heart pounding, as he prepared to face the community he had wronged. As he approached the first table, a familiar face looked up at him. Eric, the young volunteer who had confronted him earlier. John set the tray down and met Eric's gaze. "Enjoy your meal," he said, his voice calm but sincere. Eric said nothing, but his expression softened ever so slightly. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. The community dinner was in full swing, the sound of laughter and conversation echoing through the hall. The scent of roasted chicken, freshly baked bread, and spiced apple pie filled the air, mingling with the faint hum of music playing in the background. Children darted between tables, giggling as they chased each other, while adults shared stories and smiles over heaping plates of food. John stood near the back of the room, a tray of steaming dishes in his hands. He had been serving food all evening, keeping his head down and focusing on the task at hand. But now, as the dinner was reaching its peak, he knew the time had come to address what truly mattered. Grace Carter stood at the center of the room, surrounded by volunteers and attendees who regarded her with admiration. She exuded a calm authority, her presence commanding respect, without demanding it. John watched her from a distance, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. "Excuse me, Grace," he said, stepping forward cautiously. Grace turned to face him, her expression unreadable. The noise in the room seemed to fade, as a few nearby volunteers paused their conversations to observe the exchange. "Can we talk?" John asked, his voice steady but quiet. Grace regarded him for a long moment before nodding. "Follow me." She led him to a quieter corner of the hall, away from the bustling crowd. As they stood facing each other, John felt the weight of her gaze. This was his chance to begin making things right, and he couldn't afford to falter. John took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. Grace, I owe you an apology. Not just to you, but to Olivia and everyone here. Grace's expression didn't change, but her arms crossed over her chest. I'm listening. When I saw Olivia that day, I made assumptions. Terrible, unfair assumptions. I let my biases control my actions, and I hurt your family in a way I can never take back, John admitted, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't see Olivia as a little girl waiting for her mom. I saw something else entirely, and that's on me. I was wrong, and I'm so sorry. Grace's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing as she considered his words. Do you even understand what you did to her? To us? She asked, her voice low but charged with emotion. You didn't just humiliate her. You made her feel like she was less than human. That kind of wound doesn't heal easily, John. John nodded, his throat tight. I know. And I don't expect you to forgive me, not yet. Maybe not ever. But I'm here because I want to make things right. I'm here because I need to do better. Grace let out a slow breath, her gaze softening slightly. Do you know how many times I've had to explain to Olivia why people see her differently? Why she's treated differently? And then, you, someone who's supposed to protect her, prove all those fears right. John's heart ached at the pain in her voice. I can't change what I did, Grace, but I can change what I do moving forward. I want to be better, not just for Olivia, but for everyone I serve. Grace studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke. Words are easy, John. Actions are harder. Oh, if you're serious about this, you need to prove it. John nodded, determination hardening his features. I will. I promise. As their conversation ended, John glanced across the room and saw Olivia watching him. She sat at a table with a group of children, her sketchpad open in front of her. Her gaze flickered between him and her mother, curiosity and caution mingling in her expression. John took a hesitant step toward her, but Grace placed a hand on his arm. Give her time, she said softly. She's still processing. He nodded, retreating to the serving line to resume his work. But he couldn't shake the image of Olivia's wary eyes. He resolved to earn her trust, no matter how long it took. Later that evening, as the dinner wound down, and attendees began to trickle out, John saw an opportunity to extend a small olive branch. He approached the donation table, where volunteers were sorting through clothes and household items. Do you need any help here? He asked Rosa, who was supervising the process. Rosa glanced at him, her expression skeptical but not unkind. We could use someone to load these boxes into the van. John nodded and got to work, lifting heavy boxes with ease. As he carried them to the van, he noticed Grace watching him from across the room. She gave him a small nod, a subtle acknowledgement of his efforts. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the evening came to a close, John found himself alone in the quiet hall, helping to stack chairs and tidy up. He was lost in thought when he heard a soft voice behind him. Officer John? He turned to see Olivia standing there, clutching her sketchpad to her chest. Her expression was hesitant but curious. Yes, Olivia, he said gently. She held out the sketchpad, revealing a drawing of the Helping Hands logo, with a small addition, a police badge nestled within the hands. I made this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you like it? John's throat tightened as he took the sketchpad from her. The drawing was simple but powerful, a symbol of hope and unity. It's beautiful, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you. Olivia nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Maybe you're not so bad, she said, before turning and skipping away. John stood there, holding the sketchpad, his heart full of gratitude and determination. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope that he could truly make a difference. The soft glow of dawn illuminated the Helping Hands Community Center, casting long shadows across the parking lot as volunteers began their day. John arrived early, his sleeves rolled up, and his badge replaced by a plain t-shirt and work gloves. This was his new routine, one built on humility and hard work. Today, however, he felt a subtle shift in the air, a sense of unease that he couldn't quite place. As he stepped inside, he was greeted by Rosa, her eyes narrowing in the briefest flicker of suspicion before she offered a curt nod. It was progress, John told himself. Rosa, like many of the volunteers, had taken her cues from Grace, who remained watchful but fair. Slowly, the walls around him seemed to be lowering, brick by brick. The morning's tasks were physically demanding, yet John found solace in the monotony. He unloaded boxes of donated canned goods, sorted them meticulously, and helped reorganize the pantry shelves. Occasionally, he caught whispers of conversation among the other volunteers. "Do you think he's really changed?" a young woman murmured to her companion. "I don't know. At least he's trying," the other replied. John didn't let the comments deter him. Actions, not words, were his currency now. By mid-morning, Grace arrived, Olivia trailing close behind. Olivia carried her sketchpad as always, her guarded expression softening slightly when their eyes met. It wasn't quite trust, but it was no longer outright fear. During a break, John noticed Olivia struggling to drag a large box across the floor. Her ponytail bobbed with the effort, but the box refused to budge. "Need a hand?" John asked, crouching beside her. Olivia hesitated before nodding, stepping back to let him take over. John lifted the box effortlessly, carrying it to the storage area. "Thanks," Olivia mumbled, her voice barely audible. "You're welcome," John replied, his tone gentle. "What's in here anyway?" It felt like it was full of bricks. Olivia's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. "Books. For the reading program." John set the box down carefully and looked at her. "That's a great program. You must be proud to help with something so important." She shrugged, but her expression softened further. It was a small moment, but John recognized it for what it was, the beginning of a bridge. Later that afternoon, Grace approached John as he was tidying up the kitchen. She crossed her arms, her posture wary but not unkind. "I see you've been busy," she said. John paused, wiping his hands on a towel. "There's a lot to do around here. I'm glad to help." Grace studied him for a moment before nodding. "We've been watching, John. You've been consistent. That matters." "I appreciate that," he said, his voice earnest. "I just want to make things right, however long it takes." Grace's expression softened slightly. "Keep it up. Actions speak louder than words." As the day wound down, Rosa announced plans for a weekend food drive. Volunteers buzzed with excitement, brainstorming ways to maximize donations and reach more families. John volunteered to coordinate logistics, offering to transport supplies and oversee setup at the local park. "Are you sure you can handle it?" Rosa asked, her tone skeptical but not hostile. "I'm sure," John replied. "I've organized plenty of operations before. Just let me know what you need." True to his word, John spent the next few days immersed in preparations. He contacted local businesses for sponsorships, coordinated with other volunteers, and personally delivered flyers to promote the event. His military training and experience shone through, earning him grudging respect from even his harshest critics. On the day of the food drive, the park buzzed with activity. Tables laden with donated goods stretched across the grassy field, while volunteers handed out meals and supplies to families in need. Olivia stood with a group of children, distributing flyers and directing families to the appropriate stations. John watched her from a distance, marveling at her poise and confidence. She caught him looking and gave a small wave, her smile hesitant but genuine. Later, as the event wound down, John found himself standing beside Grace, surveying the bustling scene. "You did good today," Grace said, her voice tinged with a mix of surprise and admiration. "Thank you," John replied. "But this isn't about me. It's about all of us, working together." Grace nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "Maybe you're starting to get it." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in a warm golden light, Olivia approached John with her sketchpad in hand. "Officer John," she said hesitantly. He knelt to her level, smiling. "Yes, Olivia?" She held out the sketchpad, revealing a new drawing. A table surrounded by smiling people, of all colors and ages, with a police officer and a young girl at the center. Above them, she had written, "Community Unity." John's throat tightened as he looked at the image. "This is beautiful, Olivia." "Thank you." She shuffled her feet, then looked up at him. "My mom said you're coming to dinner tomorrow. Are you?" John blinked, surprised. "I am. If that's okay with you?" Olivia nodded, her smile growing. "It's okay." As she walked away, John stood there, clutching the sketchpad like a lifeline. For the first time, he felt a true sense of belonging, not just to the charity, but to the community he had once wronged. The Carter household was a cozy blend of warmth and laughter, where the walls told stories of resilience and hope. Tonight, however, an unusual tension lingered in the air. Grace had invited John for dinner, a gesture that was as much a test as it was an opportunity for dialogue. For John, it was both an honor and a nerve-wracking moment. As he approached the front door, a mix of aromas greeted him: roasted chicken, cornbread, and something sweet, apple pie perhaps. The smells reminded him of home, but the stakes tonight were far more significant than a meal. He took a deep breath and knocked. The door opened to reveal Grace, her expression calm but watchful. "John," she greeted, stepping aside to let him in. "Come on in. Dinner's almost ready." "Thank you, Grace," John replied, his voice steady but respectful. Inside, the house felt alive with activity. Olivia darted past, her sketchpad clutched in one hand, while Mark, Grace's husband, set plates on the dining table. The room was filled with photographs of the family, many featuring Grace and Olivia at charity events. John couldn't help but pause and take it all in. "Mark," Grace called. "This is John." Mark turned, his eyes narrowing slightly as he extended a hand. "Officer Miller." "Mr. Carter," John replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Thank you for having me." "Call me Mark," he said, his tone softening slightly. "Dinner's ready. Let's sit." The table was set with an assortment of dishes that reflected Grace's southern roots. Everyone took their seats, with John placed directly across from Olivia. She avoided his gaze at first, focusing intently on her plate, but the curiosity in her eyes betrayed her. Grace broke the silence. "So, John, I hear you've been quite involved at Helping Hands." "Yes," John said, his voice measured. "It's been an eye-opening experience. I've learned more in the past few weeks than I have in years on the force." Mark leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What exactly have you learned?" John met his gaze, unflinching. "I've learned that enforcing the law isn't enough. It's about understanding the people you serve, seeing their struggles, their humanity. I failed at that before, but I'm working to change." As the meal progressed, Grace decided to share her own story. She spoke about growing up in a neighborhood where opportunity was scarce and bias was abundant. "Helping hands wasn't just an idea," she explained. "It was a necessity. My mom started it when I was a little girl because we needed it ourselves. Now, it's my way of giving back." John listened intently, his respect for Grace growing with every word. "Your family's impact is incredible," he said. "I didn't realize how much until I heard stories from the community." Grace nodded, her expression softening. "And what about you, John? What brought you to law enforcement?" John hesitated, his eyes flickering to Olivia. "I grew up in a strict household. My father was a veteran, and discipline was everything. I thought becoming a cop was a way to honor that, to make a difference. But somewhere along the line, I lost sight of what that meant." Olivia finally spoke, her voice small but clear. "Why didn't you listen to me that day?" John's chest tightened. He set his fork down and leaned forward slightly, his tone earnest. "Olivia, I made a terrible mistake. I judged you before I knew anything about you. That was wrong, and I am so sorry." Olivia studied him, her expression unreadable. "Do you think you'll make the same mistake again?" "I'll do everything in my power not to," John said. "I've learned to stop and think, to see the person first, not just my assumptions. But if I ever fail, I promise to own up to it." Grace and Mark exchanged a glance, and Olivia nodded slowly. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. As the plates were cleared, Grace turned the conversation toward the future. "John, I've been thinking about how to bridge the gap between the police and our community. We can't keep having these divides." "I couldn't agree more," John said. "But what do you have in mind?" Grace smiled. "A community event, something that brings people together. Officers and residents working side by side, not just as enforcers and citizens, but as people." Mark chimed in. "It could be a picnic or a charity drive, something that shows unity." John's mind raced with possibilities. "That's a fantastic idea. I'd love to help organize it. If we can get my department involved, it could be a turning point." Grace nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Let's do it then. We'll call it the Community Unity Picnic." As the evening wound down, John found himself sitting on the porch with Mark, while Grace and Olivia cleaned up inside. "You've come a long way," Mark said, his tone contemplative. "But you've still got a lot to prove." "I know," John replied, "but I'm ready for it." Mark's expression softened. "Good. Because if you're serious about this, it's not just about fixing your mistakes. It's about being better for everyone." Inside, Olivia watched the two men talking through the window. She turned to Grace. "Do you think he's really changed?" Grace placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "I think he's trying. And sometimes that's where it starts." The next morning, John arrived at the community center, his notebook filled with ideas for the event. He greeted Rosa and the other volunteers, his energy contagious. "We're planning something big," he announced, "a day to celebrate unity. And I'll need all the help I can get." As he began outlining the plans, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just repairing his reputation. He was helping build something that could outlast his mistakes. But as the crowd around him grew, so did the weight of responsibility. Would the event succeed? Could it truly heal the rift between the police and the community? John pushed the doubts aside. He had a promise to keep, and he wouldn't let this opportunity slip away. The sun was warm and inviting as John stood at the edge of Willow Creek's Central Park, a clipboard in hand. The sprawling space dotted with picnic tables, open fields, and a small stage, was about to transform into the setting for the town's first-ever community unity picnic. For John, this was more than just a community event. It was his chance to prove that change was possible. The weeks leading up to the picnic had been a whirlwind of planning and collaboration. John had immersed himself in every detail, from coordinating with local vendors to convincing his fellow officers to participate. His once icy relationship with Grace had thawed slightly. Their frequent strategy meetings turned into conversations about their shared hope for a better future. John's biggest challenge was getting his colleagues on board. Many of them were skeptical, dismissing the event as unnecessary or overly idealistic. Officer Kevin Carter, a veteran on the force, had been particularly resistant. "John, we're cops, not party planners," Kevin grumbled during a coffee break at the station. "Why waste our time on this?" "Because it's not a waste," John argued, his voice steady but firm. "This is about rebuilding trust, Kevin. If we don't start somewhere, the divide will only grow." In the end, John's persistence paid off. Slowly but surely, officers signed up to participate, albeit reluctantly at first. Grace and John worked tirelessly to drum up excitement in the community. Flyers were distributed at local shops and churches, social media posts showcased the event's mission, and local businesses donated food and supplies. One particularly memorable day, John visited the Helping Hands Center to recruit volunteers. As he outlined the plans, Olivia sat quietly in the corner sketching. John noticed her glancing at him occasionally, but saying nothing. "Olivia," he ventured cautiously, "would you like to help? We could really use your artistic skills for the banners." Her eyes lit up, though she quickly masked her excitement. "Maybe," she replied with a shrug. Grace caught John's hopeful glance and smiled. "I think she's in," Grace whispered. The morning of the picnic dawned bright and clear. John arrived early, his heart pounding with both excitement and nerves. Volunteers were already bustling about, setting up tables and decorations. Olivia's banners featuring vibrant messages like "Unity in Action" and "Stronger Together" were strung between trees, adding a cheerful touch to the park. As people began to arrive, John made it a point to greet everyone personally. Families, teenagers, and elderly residents trickled in, their initial hesitance giving way to curiosity as they saw police officers mingling in plain clothes. At the dunk tank, John took the first seat, laughing as community members eagerly lined up to test their aim. He plunged into the cold water repeatedly, his laughter echoing across the park. It was a small but symbolic gesture that seemed to set the tone for the day. Throughout the picnic, activities were designed to encourage interaction and understanding. A role reversal exercise, led by Grace, allowed officers to experience situations from the perspective of civilians. John volunteered to go first, stepping into the role of a young black man being stopped for a routine check. The exercise left him visibly moved. "I never realized how intimidating it could feel," John admitted afterward. "This is something every officer should experience." The crowd murmured in agreement, their expressions softening toward him. Meanwhile, Olivia manned a face-painting station, where she worked quietly but skillfully. John couldn't resist joining the line, much to the delight of the children around him. When it was his turn, Olivia hesitated, her brush hovering over his cheek. "What do you want me to paint?" she asked. "Whatever you think suits me," John replied, his voice gentle. After a moment of thought, Olivia painted a bright butterfly. As she stepped back to admire her work, John caught her rare, shy smile. "It's perfect," he said sincerely. One of the biggest surprises of the day came when Officer Kevin Carter, approached the mic during the open forum discussion. John watched in astonishment as Kevin addressed the crowd. "I'll admit, I wasn't sure about this whole event," Kevin began, scratching the back of his neck. "But seeing everyone here today, talking, laughing, working together, it's changed my perspective. We've got a long way to go, but this feels like a good start." The crowd erupted into applause, and John felt a swell of pride. Kevin's words carried weight, and his endorsement was a turning point for many of the officers present. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, John took the stage to thank everyone for their participation. His voice carried over the crowd, filled with emotion. "This picnic isn't just about today," he said. "It's about laying the foundation for tomorrow. We've taken a step forward, but there's more work to be done. Together, we can create a community where trust and understanding thrive." The crowd cheered, their applause echoing through the park. For John, it was a moment of redemption, not complete, but significant. As the crowd began to disperse, Grace approached John. "You did good today," she said, her voice warm but thoughtful. "But one event isn't enough to fix everything." "I know," John replied. "This is just the beginning." Nearby, Olivia tugged at Grace's sleeve. "Mom, can we go talk to Officer John?" Grace hesitated before nodding. Olivia walked up to John, her small hand outstretched. "Thank you for today," she said softly. John knelt to her level, shaking her hand gently. "Thank you, Olivia. Your butterfly was the best part of my day." As they parted ways, John watched the Carters walk off, a sense of hope blooming in his chest. But he knew the road ahead would still be challenging. The real question lingered. Could he truly make lasting amends with the Carters and the community? John stood before the mirror, adjusting his uniform collar. For the first time in months, the weight of the badge on his chest didn't feel oppressive. It felt purposeful. His reinstatement had come with new responsibilities and opportunities for redemption, and today marked the beginning of a new chapter. As he glanced at his reflection, a mixture of nervousness and determination flickered across his face. This was more than just a return to duty. It was his chance to prove he could truly make a difference. John's first task, as part of his new assignment, was to mentor at-risk youth in Willow Creek. The program, spearheaded by Grace Carter and supported by the police department, was designed to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. John had agreed to lead workshops at the local community center, sharing lessons on empathy, accountability, and teamwork. Walking into the brightly lit center for his first session, John was met with a mix of skeptical stares and curious glances from the dozen teenagers seated around the room. These were kids who had grown up wary of authority, and John's reputation as a rigid, by-the-book cop preceded him. John cleared his throat, his voice steady but warm. "Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Officer John Miller, but you can just call me John. I'm here today to share my story, but more importantly, I'm here to listen to yours." The teens exchanged wary looks, but John pressed on. He started with an honest account of the incident that had brought him here, sparing no detail of his mistakes and the lessons he'd learned. His vulnerability seemed to chip away at their initial resistance. One boy, Malik, raised his hand. "So, you're saying you used to be like racist?" John took a deep breath. "I think I let my biases cloud my judgment," he admitted. "And I hurt people because of it. But I'm working every day to be better, to see people for who they really are, not who I assume them to be." As the weeks passed, John's efforts began to pay off. He earned the trust of the teens by showing up consistently, engaging in their lives, and treating them with respect. He organized basketball games, career workshops, and even a self-defense class that became an instant hit. One afternoon, Malik approached John after a session. "You know," he said hesitantly, "when I first saw you, I thought you were just another cop here to lecture us. But you're different. You actually care." John smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "I do, Malik. And I care because you and the others are the future of this community." John's transformation didn't go unnoticed by the department or the community. Word spread about his workshops, and soon local schools began inviting him to speak to their students. At first, John hesitated, unsure if his message would resonate beyond the teens he'd been working with. But Grace encouraged him to take the leap. "You've shown my family and this community that people can change," she told him. "Your story needs to be heard." At Willow Creek High School, John stood in front of a packed auditorium. His voice wavered slightly as he began, but as he recounted his journey, the room fell silent. He spoke not only about his mistakes, but also about the systemic challenges that needed to be addressed. "Empathy is our greatest tool," John said, his voice growing stronger. "It's what helps us connect, understand, and grow. I've learned that enforcing the law is not just about rules, it's about serving the people with compassion and fairness." The applause that followed was thunderous, and John felt a surge of hope. This wasn't just about his redemption. It was about inspiring others to join him in creating meaningful change. Back at the police station, John's efforts began to influence his colleagues. Officers who had once dismissed his approach started to see the value in his methods. John led informal discussions during coffee breaks, sharing insights from his workshops and encouraging his peers to engage with the community on a deeper level. One day, Officer Kevin Carter approached John, his expression uncharacteristically earnest. "John, I've been thinking about what you said during the picnic," Kevin began. "I think you're onto something. If you're open to it, I'd like to help out with the youth program." John's grin was immediate. "Absolutely, Kevin. The more, the better." Despite his progress, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He knew he needed to make amends with Olivia directly, not just through his actions, but through a heartfelt apology. One crisp autumn afternoon, John visited the Carter home. Standing on their porch, he took a deep breath before knocking. Grace opened the door, her expression soft but cautious. "Is Olivia home?" John asked. "I'd like to speak with her if she's willing." Grace hesitated before calling Olivia. The young girl appeared moments later, her eyes widening slightly when she saw John. She clutched a sketch pad to her chest, her expression guarded. "Hi, Olivia," John began, kneeling to her level. "I wanted to talk to you, because I owe you an apology. What I did that day at the store was wrong. I didn't listen to you, and I made you feel scared and powerless. I'm so sorry." Olivia studied him for a long moment, her gaze unflinching. "You really mean it?" she asked finally. "I do," John replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And I promise to keep working to be better, not just for you, but for everyone in this community." Olivia's lips curved into a small smile. "Okay," she said softly. "I forgive you." John felt a weight lift from his shoulders as Olivia extended her hand. He shook it gently, his gratitude evident in his eyes. As John left the Carter home, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. His journey was far from over, but Olivia's forgiveness marked a significant milestone. Back at the station, he began planning his next steps, determined to build on the momentum he'd created. The department's new community outreach program was gaining traction, and John was tasked with leading a town hall meeting to discuss future initiatives. As he prepared his notes, he couldn't help but wonder, could these small changes ripple out into something bigger, something transformative? The soft hum of chatter filled Willow Creek's community park as people gathered for the annual charity event, now rebranded as the Unity in Action Festival. The sun cast a golden glow over the sprawling lawn, where colorful tents and booths stood proudly, each representing a piece of the community's heart. John Miller stood at the entrance, greeting attendees as they arrived. His heart swelled with a mix of pride and gratitude. This wasn't just another event. It was a testament to the progress they had made together. The festival had been months in the making, an idea born during one of John's long conversations with Grace Carter. Together, they envisioned an event that would not only celebrate the community, but also bring together law enforcement and residents in a spirit of understanding and collaboration. John had thrown himself into the planning, working closely with the Carters and other volunteers. The result was a vibrant tapestry of activities, a talent showcase, booths for local artisans, and games for children. Most importantly, a conversations corner had been set up, where residents could share their concerns and ideas with officers in a casual, non-threatening environment. Olivia Carter, now brimming with confidence, stood next to John at the welcome booth, handing out flyers. She beamed as she waved at passing families. Her transformation over the months mirrored John's. Both had grown stronger, braver, and more hopeful. "Officer John," she said, tugging at his sleeve, "don't forget to visit the face painting tent. I'm painting butterflies today." John chuckled, nodding. How could I miss it? As the day unfolded, the festival became a living symbol of unity. Officers and residents played tug-of-war games, shared meals, and laughed together. One of the most impactful moments came when John stepped onto the small stage to address the crowd. Taking a deep breath, he scanned the sea of faces, familiar ones like Grace and Olivia, as well as those he had yet to meet. "Today isn't just about fun," he began, his voice steady but earnest. "It's about acknowledging where we've been and deciding where we want to go as a community." He spoke openly about his journey, his mistakes, and the lessons he'd learned. "Change isn't easy," he admitted, "but it's possible. It starts with listening, with understanding, and with taking responsibility. I'm grateful to be standing here today, not as just a police officer, but as a member of this incredible community." The applause that followed was thunderous. Grace joined him on stage, sharing her perspective and thanking everyone who had supported the festival's mission. Together, they embodied the healing power of empathy and collaboration. Later that afternoon, John found himself at the conversations corner, sitting across from a young mother who had recently moved to Willow Creek. She voiced her concerns about safety in her neighborhood and her children's future. John listened intently, taking notes and offering solutions where he could. But he also promised to bring her concerns back to the department and follow up personally. "This is just the beginning," he said with a reassuring smile. "We'll keep working on this together." A few feet away, Officer Kevin Carter was having a similar discussion with a group of teens. Seeing his once skeptical colleague embrace community engagement brought a warm sense of fulfillment to John. The ripple effect of change was becoming more tangible by the day. As the sun began to set, Olivia dragged John to the face painting tent. "It's your turn," she declared, holding up a palette of bright colors. John knelt down, allowing Olivia to paint a butterfly on his cheek. Her small hands worked with careful precision, her tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated. When she was finished, John turned to a nearby mirror. The butterfly was bright and bold, its wings spreading across his cheek like a symbol of transformation. "Perfect," Olivia announced, giggling. "Now you look ready for the festival." The moment felt like a full-circle moment for John. He saw the butterfly, not just as a decoration, but as a representation of the second chance Olivia and her family had given him. As the festival wound down, John joined the Carter family at a picnic table under the twinkling string lights. Plates of barbecue and desserts were passed around, and the atmosphere was filled with laughter and warmth. Grace looked at John, her expression one of pride and appreciation. "You've come a long way," she said, raising her glass of iced tea in a toast. "Here's to second chances, and to the community we're building together." John raised his own glass, his voice filled with emotion. "And to the people who believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." The Unity in Action Festival was declared a resounding success, with plans already in motion to make it an annual tradition. John continued his outreach work, mentoring youth and collaborating with local organizations. He became a regular presence in the Carters' lives, attending family dinners and even helping Olivia with her science projects. The police department, inspired by John's example, implemented new training programs focused on empathy and bias. Officers were encouraged to engage with the community beyond their patrols, fostering relationships built on trust and understanding. For John, the journey wasn't over. It never would be. But each step forward felt like a small victory, a testament to the power of humility, growth, and connection. The following summer, John and Olivia co-hosted the second annual Unity in Action Festival. As they stood on the stage together, addressing a crowd that had doubled in size since the previous year, John felt a deep sense of fulfillment. "Let's keep building," he said, his voice resonating with hope. "Together, we can create a community where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued." As the crowd cheered, John looked at Olivia, whose smile radiated pure joy. He knew that this wasn't just about him. It was about the countless lives touched by their shared efforts. And in that moment, he felt certain that the best was yet to come. As John and Olivia waved goodbye to the crowd, the golden glow of the setting sun painted the sky, a fitting end to a day filled with hope and unity. Their story, a journey of redemption and forgiveness, reminds us that second chances can change everything. But it's also a call to action. What can we do in our own lives to build bridges and create understanding? Now it's your turn. What moments of kindness or forgiveness have changed your life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. And don't forget, this is just the beginning. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next heartwarming story. Together, let's keep spreading hope, one story at a time. See you in the next one.